Harold Godwinson is who we're going to be talking about today, and the very much discussed and controversial Battle of Hastings in 1066. What was Harold Godwinson really like? What was the Anglo-Saxon society really like? Did he have a legitimate claim to be king? Did William the Conqueror have a legitimate claim to be king? This is episode 14 of Just Feudal Things, a conversational podcast about medieval history with subject matter experts and enthusiasts. And now Just Feudal Things is listener supported for those of you with the resources and generosity that would like to help push along my project to bring more medieval stories to light through this podcast, through other content, and through other projects that I am attempting to spin up. You can subscribe on Substack. And for those of you who are subscribed, you will see in the chat feature a chance to potentially ask a question that goes to a guest of a podcast. If you have any particular interest in a medieval subject or of a particular guest's work, you will be given advanced notice of the podcasts that are coming up and the opportunity to potentially pitch in any questions. So thank you very much to everybody who has supported the show so far and supported my work. It is very much appreciated. So today's guest is Paula Lofting. She's the author of historical nonfiction book Searching for the Last Anglo-Saxon King, Harold Godwinson, England's Golden Warrior. And she also writes historical fiction, namely an 11th century saga called Sons of the Wolf series. You'll find the links to her books in the description, and let's jump right into our discussion on Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon King of England. Okay, so the first question that is going to be on everybody's mind, or at least that I think is maybe most frequently asked about Harold, is, was he the legitimate king? Did he have legitimacy to be the king? I think we need to start talking about the succession, because that seems to be the point of highest contention.
Yeah, well, it's kind of complicated, if you like. Another good question would be to ask was William actually the legitimate king? But I think it was more of a case of somebody needed to do the job, and it needed to be an experienced man. It needed somebody who would be able to take on the might of William, somebody who'd met him, had actually had dealings with him, knew his machinations, and knew exactly what he was wanting to do. At the time of the death of Edward the Confessor, was a young boy who was 14 or 13, 14, something like that. And in some cases, he could have become king, and that things would have worked out. But in this case, where William was convinced, or William was, absolutely adamant that the throne was his, he was absolutely adamant that King Edward had offered him the throne. And he was going to take it by force if he didn't get his way. A lot of people said, well, maybe Harold's ambition was to get the throne. He may well have wanted the throne a year before, or maybe since the episode where he went to Normandy and was taken more or less hostage and forced to swear an oath on holy relics, that he would support William's claim to the throne. And you can imagine this scenario of Harold being stuck there in Normandy, and with a handful of men, and he's William saying to him, "Oh, I'm so glad you've come, because we can talk about the future, and we can talk about me being king, and all this kind of stuff." So, and you can imagine him maybe king, he wasn't king at the time, but Earl Harold sort of, being actually struck dumb by the whole situation, because he had gone there to try and secure the release of his nephew and his brother, who were hostages since 12 years before. So it was his, that was his plan, really, not to go and confirm the kingship to him. And there's lots of nuances to this, because in one of the particular sources by a man called Edmer, Edmer writes the only source that says that he went there to try and release his brother and his nephew. And because he was English, this Edmer who wrote this, although albeit quite late, maybe 60 years after the whole thing had happened. And he knew various people who knew Harold and that sort of thing. So he could have been privy to information. And so, Harold's sitting there listening to William going on about how he was going to be king, and it was going to be great because you're going to be my number one man, and I'll confirm you in all your lands and everything if you support me. And I want you to go back to England and tell my uncle, no, he wasn't his uncle, he was his cousin. Tell my cousin Edward that I'm going to, become king, and you're going to be my, advocate for me. You're going to advocate. And the thing was, he had no right to do that, really, because Harold was, he had the title Dux Anglorum, he wasn't just the Earl of Wessex at the time. He had the title of Dux Anglorum, which meant that he was probably a bigger fish than William, who was just a Duke of Normandy, the little tiny Normandy. And he was, Duke of the English. So he was probably, if anything, he should have been, asking him to be his liege. But he was very, very sort of clever. You can imagine this man being very manipulative and motivated by greed and typical man of his time, really. And so Harold thought to himself, I'm going to have to get out of here, because if I don't, I could easily wind up like some other of William's hostages and prisoners, unalived. And so he did swear on an oath that he would do all those things. And as soon as he got back to England, he basically rescinded them. Because in those days, I don't think it's just those days, but I think there is a clause in the church where if you swear an oath under duress, you could rescind that at a later date. And I think that's probably what Harold had to do. He goes back to England, and there's about another year or so. There's some civil unrest involving his brother. Him and his brother fall out. Then it sort of moves forward to Harold, King Edward dying, and Harold being chosen by the Witan, which was the government of the time, as king. In England, in Anglo-Saxon times, you didn't necessarily have to be the best man not the best man. You didn't have to actually be the heir to the throne to be the king. It was the best man for the job. To be an atheling, which was the heir, you needed to be the son of a king, which Harold wasn't. But he was able to bypass that and become king. It seemed to make sense at the time. I can see why, although it all went wrong in the end, I can see why they wanted Harold to be king, because he was very successful. He'd been very successful. He was a great sort of warrior, leading men from the front. He'd sorted out Wales, and he was very competent. Yeah, he was the best guy. He was better than a 14-year-old. He would have had my vote as well. If you look at it that way, the only link that William has or had to the crown was that he was the second cousin, not just the first cousin, but the second cousin or cousin once removed of King Edward. And that was because his great aunt was the mother of Edward, King Edward. She was Emma of Normandy. So that's the only real link he had, but wasn't by blood. He didn't have any lands there. He had no connection. And the only thing I suppose you could say that he might have, he somehow sort of, they put out propaganda in this time, and they talked about how he had met, or he had been offered the throne before that episode in Normandy with Harold happened. And there was a time that he came over in 1052, which was about 14 years before the Battle of Hastings. And that was at that time the Godwinsons had been exiled. They'd fallen out with the king, and he'd exiled the whole family. And so William came over at that point. And there is a bit in the Chronicles that says he came, had a nice time, and then went home again, sort of thing. But I think he was trying to hint that that was the time that he talked about being heir to the throne. Edward had never officially named him as his heir to the throne, because he would have had to have been an heir to the throne. Like I said earlier, he would have had to have been an atheling, and an atheling had to be a son of the king. Edward would have had to have adopted him to make him an atheling, like he did with Edgar, who was the young boy. He was his great nephew, and he would have had to have adopted him to make him his atheling. And we know that he did that with Edgar, but he didn't do that with William. There was no talk about it. And if he had done, William would have shouted it from the mountaintops, if he had. So that, I know it's a long-winded explanation. Sorry, I couldn't just give you an explanation that said yes or no, but it's, knowing the intricacies of what happened, you get a finer point on the whole thing, really.
It seems like there's a little bit of a difference then between who King Edward names as his successor versus who the Witan chooses. Is there some difference there, or do they just sort of usually nominate the successor? Obviously, they didn't in this case, but what's how does that work?
Well, according to the life of Edward, which was commissioned for his Queen Edith, there is a deathbed scene, and everyone loves deathbed scenes, where he is supposed to have nominated him as the king. But I think his successor, I think it's more symbolic than anything else. I think that was probably planned. They knew what was coming. They knew pretty much as soon as he got back from Normandy, soon as Harold would have got back from Normandy, he would have had to think about what he was going to do, because he knew that what was on the cards, that William wanted to be king. He didn't want William to be king. No, it doesn't look as if anybody else wanted him to be king. Otherwise, they would have said, "Yeah, okay then." And Normans weren't always that popular in England at the time. They were, quite a few came over with Edward, because I don't know if you know that King Edward was in exiled. King Edward the Confessor was in exile for quite some years before he came and was king. He was obviously half Norman, half English, and he brought quite a few Normans over with him, and some of them were thrown out of the country at one point because they weren't liked. They did things that may have been seen as treasonous to the English, like trying to, they might have tried to infiltrate jobs that were going, get the best jobs and that sort of thing. So they weren't well liked, and so it's not likely that they would have been happy with William as king.
I think that's
That's
pretty consistent across the board. I certainly focus on the Italian Normans, and I don't think they were liked by anybody. Which
no,
is in part kind of what I like about them, is that, they were just
yeah,
so delusional and opportunistic that,
yeah, yeah,
makes for some incredible stories as the one that we're talking about here,
yeah.
which a lot of people really enjoy. So what seems to be, is there any uh, legitimacy to the claim that Edward would have named him his successor? It seems like if he didn't adopt him, then that it probably was not real. But I don't know.
Yeah. Well, um, again, it's quite nuanced if you read the sources and you piece to being a historical fiction author allows me to fill in the gaps and try to piece things together, which may or may not be true, but could be true, plausible, that sort of thing. I do feel that there may have been some talk about it. There may have been, I can imagine like William coming over at that time when he came over in 1051. He was quite young then. I imagine he was about 20, in his 20s and mid 20s or something like that. And he had a good opinion of himself, I think. He'd had to fight really hard to win his seat in the dukedom, and he sort of may have had the sort of overvalued idea of his persona, perhaps, and thought, well, actually, if I could really do. I mean, this is great. I've got a dukedom, but I could really do with a bit more, and England is sitting there. His cousin hadn't got an hadn't got an heir, rather, hadn't got any children, and I could, maybe I could worm my way in somehow. So he may have mentioned it, and they may have discussed it, but there are other things that they think were being discussed at the time, like perhaps having an alliance of some sort to stop Vikings from raiding English shores and things like that. So, but you can imagine, like, William saying to him, well, you haven't got an heir, you kind of thing. And how about me, sort of thing? You haven't got an heir, and I'm a very upstanding man. I'm a Duke of Normandy, and I've been very successful. Edward might have said, well, okay, I'll think about it, sort of thing, when it gets nearer the time. But Edward did not have, it was not in his gift as king to give away the crown to anyone. It had to go before the Witan. It had to be an election of some sort. Yes, the king had the final stamp on it, had a lot to say about who was going to be king. That there was no doubt about that. But he actually just couldn't go and give away a crown to someone across the sea who had no real link to England. And there are other instances where there was a bishop called Robert Champart, and he was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was a Norman. He was not favourite of Earl Godwin, who was Harold's father. Earl Godwin at the time, that in the 50s, before their exile, he was the main man. He was doing the job that Harold came to do, and he didn't get on with the Archbishop of Canterbury at all. And there is a story that goes back about 15 years that Godwin had killed Edward the Confessor's younger brother, Alfred, and Champart was apparently whispering in his ear poison saying things like he's going to kill you and that sort of thing, because they had fallen out because the Archbishop of Canterbury was accusing Godwin of appropriating lands that belonged to the church. So, so they were enemies. Edward may have taken a bit of he might have felt a little bit overwhelmed by the Godwinsons, Edward, because they were everywhere. They were quite a big family, and Godwin was putting the pressure on for them all to have earldoms and things like that, and he may have been going through an anti-Godwin episode at the time, and so he was quite vulnerable to the things that this Robert of Champart was saying. So
you had mentioned that you had written historical fiction previously. So this is your first stab at nonfiction. Is that right?
Yeah.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your book and sort of what all you covered in there and how you got into that.
Yeah. So really, the main themes, I guess, are because I wanted to do something a little bit different to some of the other books that have been written about the Godwinsons or Harold, and I thought about there's one school of thought that he could trace his heritage back to Alfred the Great's father, which would have made him royal, and that if he had been royal, he would have known it, surely. I think at one point, a lot of the nobles were related to some extent. Following the research that other people have done, I couldn't find any link. So there was that. And I wanted to get the essence of him really as a man, not just this idea of a man who was a powerful earl. He became king upon the death of Edward the Confessor and lost England to the Normans. I wanted people to be able to read the real story of Harold, that he was much more than that. And, the achievements that he had actually. Yeah, another one of those aspects is that, as you've noticed, there's a lot of, people on William's side and people on Harold's side who was in the right. And I think Harold was in the right. I've come to that conclusion, which I'm not supposed to really do as a historian, but you just, I sort of see myself as a historical writer rather than a historian who looks at the facts and then makes her mind up what probably happened. Sometimes you don't know exactly. You can say it could be this, or it could be that, and it could be opposite ends of the polar. Other times it could be, it's definitely that, or it's definitely that, and it just depends really. But I wanted to kind of, talk about the things that my research evoked in me, I think. And the more I delved into the research about what the Normans did, the less I liked them, and the more I was on the side of Harold. So I guess it helps to be English as well, because, that kind of, I have that perspective on it.
I think it's probably fair to say that English or Anglo-Saxons don't really care for William the Conqueror.
Yeah.
But
That's not true. That's not really true. I know a lot of people who are on the fence, and because I'm a reenactor as well, so we get people reenacting on the Norman side, and most people like to stand at the top of the hill in at the Battle of Hastings reenactment. When I say the top of the hill, that's because that's where the English stood and tried to hold their ground against the Normans who were going up the slope on horseback, some of them. And I think there is a little bit of that the English probably would have preferred Harold to win. It's not necessarily about William and Harold. Sometimes it's about English versus Normans. And it's all in good fun, really. You can't hate people from across the span of 1,000 years. Everybody was a man or a woman of their time. So, they were just trying to survive, I guess.
Well, and one of the things that I've gotten into a little bit, I'm not very well versed on William the Conqueror, but his childhood, he seems to have one of the wildest childhoods of
Oh my gosh, yeah.
any of the ruling nobles, any of his contemporaries, I would say. And so, anybody who wants to check out your book, there will be a link to that in the description. And maybe you can tell me just a little bit. You don't have to give the whole thing away, but maybe you can tell me something that's because you said you were sort of looking into things and trying to find the real Harold. So, what is maybe one or two things that you really felt were interesting or compelling from that?
The most compelling thing I could find was the actual the lies and propaganda that the Norman sources wrote about. It puts me in mind of the mainstream media today, maybe, that just aren't always a bit economical with the truth sometimes. I found that the earliest sources that we have for the battle itself, and the events leading up to it, was the Carmen de Hastingae Proelio, and that means the Song of the Battle of Hastings in Latin. That's the earliest account that we have, and they were written by mostly Normans who wrote them. Well, actually, the gentleman who wrote the Carmen was actually, I think he was French as opposed to Norman. He was a bishop, and he'd written the Carmen to big up the French, like the French of Boulogne and Flanders, maybe those that came over Breton. They came over with William the Conqueror to fight. He was bigging them up more than William, I think, but he did have it that William had the right of it. But he gives a very detailed account of the death of Harold, and it's it's not very nice, put it that way. It's pretty blood and gore. But there is a worse one than that, and I think that was by a much later chap called Wace, Wace. He was I think he was the 13th century chronicler, and he has basically them about 20 or more Normans just chopping at him, chopping him so that you couldn't recognize his head. When you've got the Carmen, and then you've got William de Jumièges, and then he writes something, and then along came William of Poitiers, who was William's chaplain, and each time somebody wrote something, it was more and more embellished, and Harold got sort of nastier and nastier, and he was much more of a villain. By the time you got to the end of Poitiers, you'd have thought he was some sort of monster, and much of this there's no evidence for before any of this happened. Their claims that William was offered the crown, there is no evidence for that before 1067, 1066. There is actually no written evidence for that. It's all in the Norman propaganda that was written after 1066. And the reason why they did that was obviously because people weren't particularly happy about him going over to another country and committing regicide against an anointed king. He had to kind of make Harold look the worst of the worst in order for him to, for William to be accepted that, oh, yes, he was right. He was right to have done this. He was promised the throne of England. And they even think now as well that there is a historian who wrote a very good piece about the papal banner. Because do you know a little bit about the papal banner, the situation with that?
That was going to be my next question, actually, was to ask
Well,
you that I thought I had heard that the Pope had endorsed William, but I was sort of
yeah.
unsure about that.
Well, the evidence for that is really sketchy. And most of that comes from William of Poitiers, who was really trying his best to big William up so that he made Harold look the villain. And there is very sketchy evidence. Well, there's more evidence that the papal banner didn't exist on the day of the battle. They lied about that, and that they didn't get a banner until 1070, when William was really struggling to put down lots of rebellions in England. So he turned to the Pope for help, and he said, what can you do for me? And by this time, the Pope was the same Pope who had been Pope Alexander. He he was not the type of Pope that would have just said, "Oh yeah, go over there and kill the king. You've got the right of it." He would have wanted to have heard Harold's side of things. And the thing was, William again probably hearing what he wanted to hear, went to see the Pope, or sent an emissary to see the Pope for him on his behalf, and they sent them away saying, "Well, we'll organise a court proceedings or something. So we need to hear Harold's side of it." This is conjecture as well. We're just kind of popping that out there, but it is plausible because the Carmen and the chronicle that was written after the Carmen by William de Jumièges, neither of them mention the papal banner or anything about the Pope. It's only Poitiers that does. It doesn't seem likely, but we do think that he had a banner in 1070 when he asked the Pope for help, and he had another coronation as well, to kind of like say, "Well, look, I'm not going anywhere, English. You're going to have to accept me, or, carry on dying," sort of thing.
And so I do have a question about the Witan. Can you maybe just tell me a little bit about how that works? What's the process? What is I guess what's the tradition of that? Because I don't really know anything about it.
Um, so I guess it's more about the idea that you have a governing body, because England had a very, very intricate and workable administration from medieval country going on at this time, and it was probably the envy of the world. But it was very good at centralizing everything, but at the same time being able to outreach as well to the different parts of the country. So you had the earls were governing certain sections of the land, um, which sort of consisted of a few shires each. I think at one point there was one, two, three, about 5 or 6 earls, maybe. And underneath them they would have like high sheriffs, shire reeves, that sort of thing, governing the land on their behalf. So each man owed something to a lord above them, and the earls were beholden to the king, and the bishops you had the warrior class, and the on one side, and you had the ecclesiastical class on the other. So the bishops were sort of ranked as earls, maybe not so much earls. The archbishops were probably like earls. So how that kind of expands into the Witan would be that the Witan would have been made up of nobles from each shire, from each earldom, and would have been like bishops, that definitely would have been the earls and other sort of wise men. So I think Witan is actually Old English for wise men. So, and a meeting of the Witan was a Witana Gemot or Witanum. Witanamot. Don't think you pronounce the G. So yeah, that's how it works. It's just a forerunner really of the the sort of medieval curia after that, royal curia, really. So
Would they just vote on stuff? Is that sorry, would it just be a vote,
yeah.
or is there some other way that they sort of came to conclusions or
Well,
decisions?
they had two main meetings a year. One was around Easter time, and the other was September when they would gather in the taxes. So I'm assuming they sort of meet at wherever the king was, because he was quite itinerant at the time. He would go from some major. He'd go to Gloucester, he'd be in Winchester, or he'd be London. So they would meet there, and they would probably talk about who was going to be granted land. Maybe they needed to talk about a law that he wanted to introduce, and that people would bring their complaints to court as well, with their representative from around the country would come and say that I'm not getting justice, because you'd have like each earldom would have a court, regal court, that the earl would preside over, and then each shire would have their own court as well. So if you were like a peasant, and some bloke had stolen your cattle, or a sheep or something that would belong to you, you could go and you go to the court, the local court, and if you didn't get satisfaction, you could go to the shire court, and so on. So it would work like that. So there is something in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle where Godwin was trying to persuade people to vote, or to allow them to send ships to help his nephew in Denmark, King Sweyn, who was fighting against Magnus of Norway, and the other earls didn't like that idea and voted no. So things like that as well. So it was a pretty good way of coming together and talking about political stuff going on in the country.
And
Yeah.
so this very sophisticated Anglo-Saxon society, I think this is one of the big what ifs that everybody talks about. If the Battle of Hastings had been reversed, then Anglo-Saxon society or culture, whatever, would have continued or flourished. I guess in your view, what if the Hastings had been reversed? Sort of what may have been different, or what was lost, I guess, at the Battle of Hastings that many people lament.
Well, I think more about the fact that people were considered free to pretty much go where they wanted to if they wanted to. I'm not entirely sure that was always the case in every single manner, but generally, a man was free to speak his mind in the courts. You could probably tell a joke about the king being put in prison. It feels like that, as you go into sort of the later medieval period, serfdom was swapped, or they swapped slavery for serfdom, really, which are pretty much the same thing. I don't think there was a lot of difference between slavery and, slavery is rife in England at the time, but it wasn't just, we're going to go and raid a few islands or whatever and bring back slaves. It was, it could be used as a punishment. A slave was able to buy their way out of slavery, and they were able to earn money. So, it wasn't but that was seen as really bad in the eyes of the church, and that was one of the things that William wanted to eradicate. But instead, he imposed serfdom upon people, which was really, pretty much the same thing, really. You became owned by the Lord. And women were much more independent, much more higher status or well thought of in Anglo-Saxon times than they were under the Normans. That's not to say that if you were a Norman noblewoman, you wouldn't have been well thought of, or, you had rights if you owned land. But that was the thing in Anglo-Saxon times. You had women who owned land. They were given land for their mourning gift when they got married, and they could do with that land whatever they wanted to. They could give it away to whoever they wanted to. It wasn't the property of their husbands. They had a much better. I think that it was a much more respectful time for them under Anglo-Saxon times than it was when the Normans sort of came along with their new style of regime. And I think for a little while they actually kept the Anglo-Saxon, the basis of the Anglo-Saxon rules, the administration, for a while. And women didn't suddenly become nothing, sort of chattels or whatever. It took a little while, but you do see a lot of women going into nunneries to escape marrying Normans, because the Normans would have gone after women who were widows. Perhaps they'd lost their men in the Battle of Hastings, and if their husbands had lost their lands, if their husbands had fought at Hastings, the family, the children that were orphaned, not orphaned, disinherited. Yeah, so they might go for the wife and try and get their lands that way. Which meant that, in essence, the children were disinherited.
And that's maybe a good time for me to plug potentially the next episode of the podcast is with, I think, one of the world's foremost experts of feudalism, because I want to kind of get down to this, dive into this question a little bit about serfdom and slavery and all those things. So we'll be talking about that in depth, I believe, in the next episode. We're coming up on time, so I'll leave you with the last word here. If anybody would like to check out your book further, the link for that will be in the description. And maybe if you want to give us the last word on Harold Godwinson, maybe what you think, people should sort of learn about him, or what's worthwhile studying about him, or, sort of him as the last Anglo-Saxon king. If you have anything else that you'd like to say about that, you can, the floor is yours.
Well, yeah, he had 20 years basically running the country for the king. For King Edward, who, mainly sat back and liked his, pleasures of the hunt and singing and dancing and whatnot. And Harold did a lot of the actual sort of, active side of being the king. I think it's such a shame, such a travesty that he was killed that day, because he had 10 months, and what did he do in that 10 months? He fought 2 battles and had to really fight hard to try and keep order in the country, as things were sort of going a little bit astray at the time, because he had to go up north and try and get them on side. So he worked really hard, and he should have been king. And I think, it's a shame, because he was. There isn't really much that you could say he did that was bad. The Welsh might have a different view, and I know that they do, but he was doing exactly what any medieval warrior king would have done at that time. And I think he would have been a really good king. On the other hand, we will never know. But from what his achievements were, I think he did have his people at the heart of what he did.